Hey folks, Rex Bear here with Leak Project. We have a fantastic show lined up for you with Richard C. Hoagland. This guy is a pioneer in the disclosure movement, founder and chief investigator of the Enterprise mission, radio host at The Other Side of Midnight, former science advisor to CBS and Walter Cronkite, recipient of the Angstrom Medal, author and whistleblower. Mr. Hoagland's work has been featured in many magazines and news outlets around the world and is a regular guest with Coast to Coast AM. We will be discussing several incredible anomalies discovered via NASA and other satellites sent to Iapetus, Phobos, Mars, Pluto, and our own moon right next door. You can find more about Richard and his work as well as analysis at www.enterprisemission.com. Also, make sure to listen to his radio program, othersideofmidnight.com. Richard, it's great to have you on the show tonight with us here at the Leak Project. How the heck are you?
Hi, Rex. Great being here.
It's fantastic to have you. We talked for a minute before the show. As I said, I've been following your work now for years, and I'm just amazed with these anomalies that you've discovered on different celestial bodies. The first topic I was hoping we could discuss is Iapetus and all the incredible information that you've got compiled on your website that points to it possibly being an artificial moon even. It looks just like the Death Star, in my opinion.
Isn't that amazing?
It is, yeah,
That
absolutely.
is so eerie. Well, actually, Rex, we should go back to the beginning. I used to be, straight mainstream, as you said, Cronkite's advisor, NASA, etc., museums, mainstream science, hung out with Carl Sagan, Arthur Clarke, one of my best friends, obviously, until he died, and Gene Roddenberry and all that. And anyway, so what got me into all of this, and why we're having this discussion this evening, is about 30, 40 years ago, I started looking at some images of Mars, and I realized that there was something astonishing that other scientists, other journalists, other investigators had not all put together, and that is that there appears to be a global civilization, an ancient, extraordinarily high-tech civilization that once lived on Mars and is no more. And that collapses probably 20 years into one sentence because NASA has not been cooperative. They're the ones initially taking all these images, and it's only because of leaks, because of finding other versions of images, of finding people who are willing to talk about what they've seen in the labs like at JPL or in Houston or other places at NASA, that we've kind of pieced together the idea that NASA for the last 50 years, if not, slightly longer, given that its first spacecraft was launched in January of 1958, it has been engaged in a methodical, systematic cover-up of everything that's real in the solar system made by somebody. They'll tell us the geology, they'll go on about the magnetospheres and the radiation and the particles and the layered sediments and the various atmospheric processes. The thing they cannot go near, the thing that they won't touch, the thing that they haven't told us the truth about from day one is the fact that we are living, Earth now, 21st century, we are living and orbiting in a previously inhabited solar system whose inhabitants wielded technology that was basically the equivalent of the gods. As my old friend Arthur Clarke would say, any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. This technology, this physics is basically magic. It seems to contradict what we think we know in terms of EM physics. And it allowed them to remodel and remake and reorder the entire solar system. And then something incredible happened a long time ago, millions of years ago. We really don't have any kind of an exact date yet because we don't have ground truth. And everything went away. And we're what's left. We're the survivors. Are we the survivors of the guys who originally did all this millions or even billions of years ago? Is the human race the logical successor, genetic successor to these beings? I have no idea because, again, we don't have ground truth. But, Rex, what I can say to you tonight is that everything that NASA has told us about the solar system, everything that ESA, which is the European Space Agency, has told us, everything the Japanese have told us, everything the Russians have told us, everything the Chinese and the Indians, and am I forgetting anybody who sent spacecraft into space? I don't think so. Every one of these nations is part of a cabal to basically withhold announcing, discussing, presenting, describing, outlining, or explaining the real artificial stuff out there, which is all over, from Mercury, we now know, to Pluto. And instead, they've given us a sterile solar system, sans the works of intelligence, because somehow that subject, who we really are descended from, and what really happened in the past is all taboo.
Well, and why do you think that is? Why don't they want us to know where we came from?
That's the $64 million question. And again, I can speculate. I can refer to certain comments by officials. I can refer to news reports. How at the end of every news report, regardless of what network, regardless of what station, regardless of what country, if they do UFOs or ETs or any kind of off-world story, it's always called the kicker. It's always at the end of the newscast, and it's always ha 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 ha. Isn't that funny?
Right.
Systematically, we are being programmed and have been programmed for obviously decades, if not centuries, that we're the only thing that is. Now, that, of course, when you ask for the explanations, why? Well, the first explanation probably is religious. In all of our religious traditions, except for the Eastern traditions, Hinduism, etc., basically, human beings, man, as it's called in the Old Testament of the Bible, is all alone. We're it. We're the cat's meow. We're the top of the totem pole. We're the apex of Darwinian evolution. We're whatever supreme position you want to put the human race in, Rex. That's where officials and the mainstream and academia and religious authorities and everybody else has put us. So any evidence against that, basically shattering that paradigm, telling everyone at some point on the planet who reads their religious texts that the most fundamental part of those texts, that we're alone, is wrong, start right there. That, I think, is the fulcrum. That's the reason we have been systematically lied to on this data for decades.
And that definitely makes the most logical sense, in my opinion. I remember several years ago, a long time ago, back in the 90s, when the Phoenix Lights happened, and then there was the official report about what happened, and they, a lot of people in the audience thought they were actually going to come out with disclosure, but then they put on that fake alien mask and mocked it, like what you're talking about. So, yeah, they've been doing that for forever. And
well, do you remember that it was the governor that sponsored that press conference where the fake alien came out and they took his helmet off and everybody laughed? And it was a systematic government effort started by the governor of Arizona that night to cover up.
Well, and didn't he even see something? Didn't he actually come out before?
Very good, Rex. I was going to get to that. It turns out, decades later, he admitted on a national news show, I forget which, I think it was Larry King. I think Larry King interviewed him. He admitted that very evening he had seen the same damn thing and had been stunned by it, and then had to come out the next day at a press conference and pretend nothing had happened. What he'd seen in the sky, an object, a delta-winged craft that, was like half a mile wide or something. I mean,
right.
Astonishing, hovering, floating on anti-gravity across the Sun Valley over Phoenix. And the governor of the state simply could not look at a TV camera and say, I saw something amazing. We need to find out what it is. So is there a cover-up? Of course there's a cover-up. Why is there a cover-up? I think it goes back to the fundamental religious tenets that we've all been taught in the Western world, that we're it.
Now, the Star Wars movie that came out in '77, it portrays the Death Star, and it looks just like Iapetus. It looks very similar to Mimas and Deimos, and these are these moons that orbit the outer rings of Saturn. And I'm thinking to myself, is it just a coincidence, or was there previous knowledge, and this is like a way to, subconsciously bring it out to the masses? What's your take on that?
I think George Lucas is an insider. I think Star Wars is our real history. Let me repeat that. I think Star Wars is our real ancient galactic history, and everything else is fake. Everything else is made up. Everything else is just academia feeding us a line because we cannot, for all kinds of reasons, know the truth. And the reason that I think George Lucas is on the inside is because when you start comparing the data we're putting together on the solar system, the extraordinary high-tech civilization that once was here before us, the major modifications, not just of the surfaces of various planets, but the actual rearranging of planets, redesigning the system, moving planets. I mean, that takes major understanding of gravity and inertia and all that. So torsion field physics, we now know, based on separate experimentation that started in the old Soviet Union back even before the Cold War ended, we now know that such a physics is real, that it exists, that it can create phenomenon, that it can be developed into technology, that you can basically create torsion field technologies to remove gravity and change inertia and move across space and find energy from beyond this dimension, etc. So given that incredible technological foundation, the idea that someone before us long ago rearranged everything that we're looking at becomes a little less, hard to swallow. So when I found during the Cassini mission in 2004 that the Cassini spacecraft had gone by one of these moons of Saturn and had relayed back pictures that showed that this moon, Iapetus, which was the star, by the way, of Arthur C. Clarke's, famous 2001: A Space Odyssey, in the in his novels, it was Saturn and Iapetus where the bizarre Stargate and the keys to a high-tech, previous technological presence in the solar system, et cetera, was basically sequestered. So when I'm looking at the actual real images from NASA of Iapetus in the late winter, early spring of 2004, 2005, in those few days around the turn of the year, what I was stunned by was that the images of Iapetus not only looked geometric, but in fact, at some angles, some light, and some images taken, days into the sequence, it actually did look like the Death Star in Star Wars. So, big picture, I think NASA is quietly assembling data to basically document all over the solar system, including its recent visits to asteroids and comets and little tiny objects that we normally wouldn't think of as part of the mainstream decoding of how the solar system came to be. I think that they've been running two parallel missions. One that we get to see the geology, the history, the how did the solar system originate and how did it evolve and how did the various environments, develop the way they are now, and the hidden mission, the secret mission, as my friend Keith Laney says, one of my imaging guys, is to document and find a lot of artifacts and try to put together by remote control, by remote sensing, the ancient history of this planet. And somehow George Lucas got access to something, and he's created a series now, which is it's historic. It's basically iconic that we kind of tend to think of, history out there in the universe and in the galaxy at least, in terms of that model, even if we don't think it's real. Well, folks, I think large portions of what Lucas put together is in fact incredibly distorted, remade, amplified, extended, modified history. And when we finally find the libraries out there, including those somewhere in Iapetus, we're going to find out that this is reality.
So let's talk about the Iapetus possibility of it being a artificial moon, like the whole thing, and the way that it was constructed. If you go to your website, enterprisemission.com, there's a section on there that breaks down your theory on how you feel it was built with, and correct me if I'm wrong here, basically a tetrahedron truss type technology.
Yeah, basically, if you go to Enterprise, you look for, search in Google or wherever, if you want to go there first. Arthur C. Clarke Moon with a View. That's the name of the series. It's a 5-part series on Iapetus. And what I do is I start with the imagery and I proceed methodically to analyze the images, to analyze the light effects, to analyze comparisons, to analyze, composites with star backgrounds to show us this 3D geometry. Iapetus seems to be, Rex, a 900-mile wide artificial planetoid. Now, if you think that that's impossible, then you haven't looked too deeply into the physics and the technology of doing things like this. But all I would do is to refer you and your audience to the works of people like Freeman Dyson, who was a very noted astrophysicist, worked for decades at Princeton. I think he's still with us. Anyway, Freeman Dyson basically wrote a paper several decades ago about an artificial society building a construct that would completely envelop their star. This was a physics projection, a physical model of what civilizations someday would do when they were threatened with the ultimate, energy crisis. The idea was to harness the energy of their entire star, and to do that, they would have to put space habitats into orbit around their star, and to do that, they would have to deconstruct the planets of that star to turn the planetary material into habitat material, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Well, that's where the idea that star systems can be reorganized and rearranged came from in mainstream science. The only problem is people have now not put together yet what Dyson predicted might happen somewhere in the galaxy with what NASA is now confirming with every additional image that they send back is in fact happened here in this solar system. Except we haven't englobed the sun. The artificial rearrangements were to the planetary objects that are in the orbit plane, in the so-called equatorial plane of the solar system. And so whatever was going on here was interrupted before it could be completed in terms of Dyson's model, I guess.
Do you think it was like a solar war similar to Star Wars? Or do you think it was like
that's a very interesting question. I have always felt that the reason that this whole thing fell apart is because of a huge civil war, an enormous civil war. There are some indications now from new data, particularly from the New Horizons mission to Pluto, that maybe we are looking at potential invasion as well as a civil war. There's nothing that says that you can't have both, right? You could have two guys going at it, and then the third party joins the fray to take the side of one of the antagonists to basically defeat the other to get something. So again, until we find the libraries, and we know because technological civilizations have to have libraries in order to function, we know someday out there, somewhere, we're going to find the libraries, plural, because any sufficiently advanced technology not only is like magic, but also has to be distributed. It has to be redundant if it's to survive. So like the internet, where if you kill a part of the internet, it doesn't matter. You simply go to another computer, log on, and bingo, there's all your data. I think that the information system, the ancient information system that held the solar system together when this Type 2 civilization was running things, I think that there will be an incredible distributed set of nodes to an kind of a solar system internet, if you will, and that once we find a working node, we'll be able to tap into this library of incredible information going back to how when the solar system was rearranged and who did it and where they came from and their history and the history of them before that and before that. In other words, once we tap into that library system, wherever we find parts of it that are still working, still intact, we're going to be privy to an extraordinary avalanche of information that is going to completely, totally revamp our entire history, our entire vision of science and religion and spirituality and what we are doing here in material bodies when the reality is the consciousness seems to exist outside of material, implementation.
Right.
And all of that is going to not inundate the human species until the ultimate authority figure, which will be an ET civilization that was here before us, is made known. And in fact, in some senses, it's probably good that we have to still reach and strive to get that data, Because if we already had it now, the possibility is that the information and the reality is so overwhelming that even scientists will say, what's the point? Why should I bother to study anything? It's all been learned, and it's in this galactic library of which there's a node in the solar system. And so why bother to continue? I mean, that's an obvious, worst case projection.
Sure.
That comes off Margaret Mead. Margaret Mead was an anthropologist back in the 1950s who basically wrote that if we ever found extraterrestrials, we should never let anybody else know because it would kill the spirit of our civilization, of humanity. It would keep us down. It would basically make scientists think that there was nothing left to find. And Margaret Mead's voice became preeminent in a NASA document that we've now unearthed from the 1960s, from the early 60s, which basically said, and I'm going to paraphrase now, if we find them, we have to hide them because the human race can't stand them, can't survive them, can't persist beyond them because we will be too demoralized. That was Margaret Mead's position, and that became NASA policy in this document called the Brookings Report. And I think that is the documentary basis for the cover-up that's gone on for decades because the officials, the folks in government, the folks that have been briefed on this all think that we will collapse and we will lie down and do nothing if we find that we're not the first, that we're not the smartest, we're not the best, and in fact that we are heirs to a legacy which is fantabulous beyond this planet.
That's unfortunate. I wonder if she
Of course
really...
it is. It's awful. It's their projection. I don't think that's what would happen at all. But again, we're at the hands, Rex, of people who are in authority who can control the access to the information.
Right.
They control the propaganda spin machine and all the networks and all over the internet. They basically can keep us thinking we're all alone, even though the reality, the data, is telling us exactly the opposite.
Well, and even as a little boy growing up, I always felt like there was something more to what I was being told. I've always been fascinated with Mars. Many years ago, I saw those photographs from the Viking orbiter, and that shows what looks like a civilization, an old civilization, and a giant face of like a sphinx. And I talked to people about that many years ago, and they kind of laughed it off. But it's really unfortunate because it's almost like the opposite, in my opinion, would happen if disclosure was in full force. The people would be excited and embrace that and look for something. We do have these abilities to get off of fossil fuels and travel the stars like Silver Surfer and experience this like it's in our own planet. So, but and that's a whole other topic and a whole other subject. But I think you're absolutely right when you say religion has probably one of the biggest influences in that, and maybe it would break this, I don't know, I don't want to say soul, but maybe it would break people's hearts in the sense where they would feel that way. I don't know. There's a lot of sheep out there, but people are waking up every day. And that's what I love about what you do. And with the pictures that you've put together, and I'd like to jump back to Iapetus here because it looks like, and in my opinion, I'm trying to figure out why there would be a 20-mile high and a 20-mile wide, tower almost, or something that comes up 20 miles high, 20 miles wide, and it goes around the entire circumference of this planetoid. And then I think of CERN.
Oh, are you talking about the equatorial ridge on
Yes,
Iapetus?
Exactly. I mean, is it like CERN related? Do you think it's something?
Well, hang on. If I remember my numbers, it's about 60,000 feet high, I think.
Okay.
Which, if you divide 60,000 by 5,920, what do you get? 12? It's about 12 miles high, I think.
Okay. So, and thanks for correcting me on that.
And the reason it's so wide is because it's slumped. It's basically in ruin. It's basically been incredibly eroded. It's been bombarded by everything else in the solar system that went to hell in a handbasket when the war took place and a planet was destroyed. Did we forget to mention that little detail?
Are you talking about the asteroid belt?
Yeah. And so when you look at Iapetus is the worst for wear from being bombarded by a huge amount of material from the exploded planet in the asteroid belt back during, as I'm now beginning to think about it, the Great War. And when you think about this huge civil war that basically pitted planetary busting weapons against each side, it's kind of astonishing that the solar system survived in as good a condition as it is. I mean, the fact is, we were finding all kinds of things. It's not hard to find things out there. It's obviously impossible for NASA to tell us politically it's finding things, and that's why we're at a stalemate until there's some kind of breakthrough.
Right. And also, I'm wondering what you think Iapetus was built for. Do you think it was built as a weapon or a warehouse?
I'm beginning to think that Iapetus and maybe Pluto are two artificial objects. I mean, Pluto's 1,500 miles across. But again, with this kind of technology, you can redesign planets, so that's no big deal. It's orbited by 5 objects. They're called moons, but they're not. One of them actually looks, if you look at the color photographs of one of the moons of Pluto, and I'll give you a web link in a minute so you can actually see this stuff. It looks like a flying planetary arcology in interplanetary orbit. It looks like one of the final acts of this civilization was to put one of their big flying cities, glass cities, roughly 12 miles, in diameter and maybe 4 or 5 miles high, into orbit around Pluto, again, as a message, as a, this is what we were, this is who we were, this is what we have saved for you, come and find it. Those two places, Pluto and Iapetus, almost appear to be, I don't know, massive ships, massive vehicles, massive craft. And maybe they're the vehicles and craft that the original inhabitants used to come to this solar system before they redesigned it.
Okay. And also, what's your take on remote viewing?
Remote viewing. Well,
and there's a reason I'm asking that.
Okay, I know. On good look, I think remote viewing depends on the individual. I think it depends on talent. I think it depends on like any other creative endeavor. It all depends on the individual.
Okay.
I think some individuals can be trusted, and others can't, just because the signal to noise ratio is too low.
Sure.
The art form, of course, is figuring out which guys can be trusted and which guys can't.
Absolutely, with anything, and I agree 100%. I've interviewed dad,
but I don't discount it. That was my point.
Sure.
I think remote viewing in certain circumstances can give us accurate pictures. Yes.
Yeah, and I appreciate that. And the reason I'm asking that is because I've interviewed Courtney Brown and Dick Algier on their remote viewing sessions that they did on Iapetus. It's funny, I interviewed Courtney probably, 4 or 5 years ago after I discovered your work, and I told him during the interview, I said, man, you should remote view Iapetus. And he never said anything about it. And then several years later, he comes out with their findings on Iapetus, and he's never admitted that I gave him that idea. But
I'm totally unaware of this. So Courtney Brown, for folks that may not remember, is the remote viewer guy, scientist, who got in deep trouble along with Art Bell.
Yeah. When
they remote viewed Comet Hale-Bopp and that whole disaster, total disaster, and then the death of those 39 Heaven's Gate people in what were they, San Diego, down around?
Yes, Heaven's Gate, that cult that basically thought that they were going to kill themselves and fly off.
I also thought it was very ironic that 39 of them killed themselves, and 39, of course, is twice 19.5. So what did they know?
Very odd. And they claim that they thought, and they remote viewed Iapetus, and the findings that
this is Courtney.
Well, Courtney doesn't do the remote viewing now. He's just a director for the Farsight Institute. There's Dick Algier and Daz Smith. These are the two individuals that did the sessions. They're probably two of the best remote viewers out there right now, or in the top 5 in the world. And
so when do they do sessions on Iapetus?
They did multiple sessions on Iapetus, actually. I think it was last year sometime. They came out with their findings.
Okay, hang on. So it's last year. Mm-hmm. We published this 5-part series on Iapetus based on the Cassini imagery and data back in 2005.
Uh-huh.
So
yes,
we're
many years ago.
Like 10 years, between our work and theirs. So what did they find?
Well, they came back with it being what they found was like an art. They think it was like some type of resort, some type of structure that was built by somebody similar to maybe Elon Musk back in the day that had all the money and resources and just very eclectic. And they think it was a resort that was built there most likely because of the view that it has, as well as possibly healing properties. But they don't think it was used for any type of war or anything. So very interesting.
Okay, this is where we really have to discuss this, because that idea, that model, is in my original posting in that series of 5 articles on Enterprise Mission. I talk about the resort. I talk about Moon with a View. I talk about leveraging that because it's in a very high angle. I believe the orbit of Iapetus is 15 degrees to the mid-plane of the orbits of the other Saturnian moons. So you would have this incredible view. You would also go up and down through that ring plane like Pluto goes up and down through the central plane of the solar system. So it would keep you out of debris if there was debris in that, central ring plane of Saturn. But again, I'm a little bit disappointed because they haven't surprised us, Rex, with anything. They're basically simply taking my model published a decade before, and they're saying that's what they get from the remote viewing. Now, it's all very possible that I was so stunningly prescient in my analysis that I hit it right 10 years ago or 15 years ago.
Right.
And that they simply reaffirmed and confirmed. But the problem with remote viewing is we won't know until we go there and find the damn libraries and find out what's inside, will we?
You're absolutely right. Absolutely. And I appreciate that. And it's kind of neat to hear what you're saying, because if you believe those guys that did this, you can watch them live while they do these sessions. And if you believe what they're saying, it just correlates with what you say. It backs it up. And I think that's awesome. Very impressive.
Well, again, I don't want to jump to the conclusion that they've confirmed our model, because we don't have confirmation of either investigation approach. And we won't until we send robots to Iapetus, to find the doorways to get inside and find the working libraries. Now, what are the odds that we're going to find working libraries? Well, we happen to know that if you take away the atmosphere and you hide stuff under shielding, you can protect it from radiation, you can protect it from oxidation, you can protect it that way from meteor bombardment, from, basically sandblasting, which means in the center or near the center of a 900-mile wide object, say that real fast 3 times, you will probably find existing structures, working electronics, all the things we would need to basically get the libraries there working again to find out what the real history is. So this is not a fool's errand. What I'm proposing is that if we aggressively created a real space program and developed the real technologies to go and ask the right questions of the objects still surviving in the system, we could easily, within the next 10, 20 years, get the real history. But the question seems to be, does anyone in power here on Earth really want the rest of us to know that everything we think we know about our own history and the history of the solar system is wrong?
Right. Yeah, hopefully some big names, maybe, Elon Musk, man. Maybe this guy will come out with something cool. I know they're working on the space program, trying to privatize it. And if enough smart people out there get together, from college or whatever.
The cool thing about Elon Musk is that if he completes the development cycles on the new technology, the relandable first stage of the Falcon 9 rocket, and then ultimately that he wants to make the second and the third stage of a 3-stage rocket also recoverable.
Great.
That means that instead of throwing a rocket away, which is the price equivalent of a Boeing 747, you basically reuse the same vehicle again and again and again, which means, let's say the Enterprise mission wanted to send a probe to Iapetus to find the libraries, right? Right now, it cost us hundreds of millions of dollars. Now, if Elon Musk succeeds, he has said that he is able to now project in the numbers that he can reduce the cost of the rocket technology to get spacecraft into space by a factor of between 10 and 100. Now, your average mission now costs around $100 million, right? Suppose he reduces the cost down to $1 million. You can raise $1 million on Kickstarter. You can
Right.
raise $1 million in the private equity markets. You can raise $1 million, particularly if you show them data that if they pay for this and put the spacecraft together, which is off the shelf because there's all kinds of technology, you just buy it from the companies that are making it, whether it be Boeing or SpaceX or Ariana or Ariane or any of the other companies. All that stuff exists. It's just priced out of the normal market. If Elon Musk can drive the market price down by a factor of 100, it means that all kinds of private robotic expeditions, Rex, could be launched from this planet, could fan out across the whole solar system, not just Iapetus, return us real data, real information, real ground truth from rovers that we would build. In other words, we're on the threshold, maybe, just in terms of conventional chemical-based rocket technology. We're on the threshold of maybe a stunning revolution in how we, how during the political campaign, all the candidates are talking about taking back America,
Right.
taking back our government and all that. Maybe we could take back our space program and really find out what's out there. And that, of course, would transform the Earth.
Oh, it'd be incredible. And, hopefully that's the next step. It certainly seems like more information is available to people, and hopefully we'll be able to use this to our advantage. But, also I'm thinking about, I want to jump maybe to Phobos now. When in the 1960s, I think it was Dr. Fred Singer, he was an advisor to the Eisenhower guys, and basically he said that Phobos is artificial. And I know that you've got a lot of information on that. I was wondering what you could share with us.
Well, first of all, I'm very impressed with the perspicacity of your questions. You have definitely done your homework, Rex. I got to give you, a gold star for that.
Thank you very much.
Nobody knows about Fred Singer. Fred Singer was a geologist who, as you said, was one of the advisors to the Eisenhower administration. And he proposed, basically, because none of the other models fit, that based on the Sharpless data, there was an astronomer at Lowell Observatory called Sharpless who had measured the rotation around Mars of the inner moon Phobos. And what he found, looking at like 100 years of data from when Asaph Hall discovered Phobos in 1877, in the summer of 1877, to basically now, in the 1950s, Singer looked at Sharpless data. Sharpless data said that Phobos was not proceeding in a very nice methodical orbit around Mars, but in fact was accelerating. Now, what does accelerating mean in spaceflight terms? It means that Phobos was moving faster and faster. Well, and we're talking not, miles per second. We're talking feet per second, which over years adds up to a difference between where it would have been and where you actually photograph it. So what would cause Phobos to basically be moving faster around Mars? It would only move faster in terms of normal Newtonian, Keplerian celestial mechanics if somehow Phobos' orbit was changing, and Phobos' orbit could only be changed if the Martian atmosphere was somehow slowing it down, even at that height of 6,000 miles above the planet. And that could only happen if Phobos was incredibly light, like styrofoam, as opposed to rock. Phobos is a body roughly 15 miles across. It's shaped like a potato, so it's longer in one axis and in the other axis than in the third axis. So it's a misshapen potato orbiting Mars roughly 6,000 miles above it, keeps one face toward Mars, one face away, just like our moon, because it's in what's called a tidal lock, and yet it seemed to be accelerating. And the only way that could be explained, both by Sharpless, who was the astronomer here at Lowell, as well as a Russian astrophysicist named Shklovsky in the 1950s, was if, in fact, the Martian atmosphere was basically pulling it down. Like Earth satellites, they re-enter because of friction with the Earth's atmosphere, right?
Right.
Okay, so think of Phobos as a huge, huge, huge artificial satellite, which is basically like a balloon. It's 15 miles wide, but there's almost nothing inside, so its mass is very, 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 very low. So the very low density of the Martian atmosphere at 6,000 miles, again, this is all 1950s calculations, could provide enough drag to cause it to spiral in very slightly toward Mars, every orbit, and that gave you the acceleration. Okay, that's the state of the art when we left the Phobos mystery, when Shklovsky and Carl Sagan, remember, Carl Sagan and Shklovsky did a book together, right?
Right.
And the, Phobos as an artificial object was a major part of that book, right? So then the background goes silent until we get to the Russian missions, Phobos 1 and 2, that go to Mars in 1988 and try to go into orbit around Phobos and die. The spacecraft disappears.
Yeah.
Suddenly, all information is lost. The signal is lost. The last picture that comes back shows this big, kind of long cylinder-shaped object in space in front of the spacecraft in the vicinity of Phobos, and then no more information. So then we fast forward the film to the NASA missions, particularly the earlier. I'm kind of getting this out of sequence because our Viking mission went to Mars in '76. The Russians went to try to go to Phobos in '88. Our Viking mission photographed Phobos from afar, from orbit, in '76, '77. Sagan made a big deal about those pictures, got them taken. NASA apparently hadn't even planned to take pictures of the Martian moons, which I frankly find, Rex, unbelievable. I think
it's ridiculous.
Of course, it's you go to a new planet and you don't photograph the moons. I think that's part of a window into the conversations behind the scenes between Sagan and the NASA officials regarding what the nature of Phobos really was, and the unwillingness to put out the imagery in public until it had been vetted, until they made sure there were no obviously artificial installations on the surface of this knobby, potato-shaped object circling Mars every 7 hours. So, bottom line, we now get to the HiRISE mission, which is a super-duper telescope that we put into orbit around Mars, kind of like Hubble in Mars orbit, but looking down at Mars. And they're taking photographs of objects on the surface of Mars that are on the order of a few inches across. Well, the HiRISE people turned the camera toward Phobos a few years ago and took stunning color photographs of Phobos. And on those photographs, you can see all kinds of geometric alignments, like a checkerboard, like a tic-tac-toe game, where you have things arranged at right angles, lines, different colors, aluminum kind of like sheen, reflection compared to brown oxidized dirt or whatever. And then we got the Mars Express images, which came much closer in the last few years. The Mars Express mission was sent by the Europeans to Mars back in 2003, and eventually they got enough confidence in maneuvering and controlling the spacecraft. Again, this is all done by remote control. You send radio signals, you hope the computer interprets them right, you fire the rockets in the right direction, and the spacecraft changes position. And so it takes a little while to kind of get good at that, particularly when you're dealing with gravitational fields that aren't uniform. So toward the end years of the Mars Express mission, the Europeans got ballsy enough, can I say that on radio? I guess I can, to basically tweak the orbit of Mars Express to where it came within like 10 miles of Phobos. Now, if they'd made a miscalculation in their orbits, they could have smacked into Phobos. A, that's the end of the mission, and B, what happens to Phobos if you do that? You don't want to do that. So they had to really, really, really be sure that they could tweak the orbit of Mars Express so that it would pass near Phobos, but it wouldn't hit Phobos, and they were successful. And they were able then to do very sophisticated analyses, Rex, of what's inside Phobos. They didn't use remote viewing. What they did is they watched the trajectory change of the Mars Express spacecraft as it went past within like 10 miles of this 15-mile diameter little knobby potato, right? And then they watched how the trajectory changed. And the implication was any trajectory changes will be caused by the gravity field of Phobos, okay? And even more interesting, they felt they would be able to pull out of that data whether Phobos was, in fact, as we said before, a big hollow balloon with nothing inside it, or in fact it was more dense and it had cavities or voids or big spaces inside it. And lo and behold, based on the gravity tracking data just a year or two ago from Mars Express, the Europeans announced that Phobos, the little 15-mile wide Phobos, potato shaped, full of craters, dark, very dark, like one of the blackest objects in the solar system. It's blacker than coal, blacker than carbon. It's like 4 or 5% reflectivity. It appears to be a solid object with big voids inside, big gaps, big holes, big caverns under a crust, which of course has got holes in it too because of cratering. In other words, Phobos is not a solid object, but it appears to have, Rex, all kinds of interior volumes in which you could house things, people, agriculture, productivity, factories, farming, atmospheric generation. In other words, Phobos is not a rock. Phobos is something much more exciting, which then was confirmed by the radio signals they were able to send through Phobos and to receive and to analyze the interior electromagnetically. So we've got two separate data points that say Phobos is not a solid object. It's got hollows inside, and it is not anywhere near as massive as we would think. And there's no real natural mechanism that anybody can think of to create an object like Phobos in Mars orbit with those internal parameters. So that data moves us closer to the idea that, yeah, Phobos really is another big blankety blank spaceship.
Well, and then let's get into the possibility. You bring up that, those several satellites by the Russians that were sent out there that disappeared, no contact back.
Yeah, that was Phobos 1 and 2.
And then you've got, the rings of Saturn and those incredible planetoids that orbit that look like a bunch of Death Stars, and they've got book.
You mean the real little guys?
Yeah, and then there was that book that came out called many years ago called the Ring Makers of Saturn, and there's pictures of these giant cylinder-looking things that look very similar to what was last seen from the satellite sent out to look at Phobos. I'm wondering if they're one and the same, and I'm wondering if there's possibly still people in that. In Phobos, and it's being protected by that ship.
Well, see, now this is the interesting question. First of all, whatever was it left the air before it disappeared cannot be a spaceship as we define spaceships. You know why? It's too dark. Physics. It's too dark. Optically, it's too dark. In fact, Tom Van Flandern, before he died, he was a friend of mine. He was the chief celestial mechanics expert at the U.S. Naval Observatory in Washington, D.C. He was the scientist who had basically first proposed the idea that there had been a massive planetary catastrophe, a destruction of a whole planet in the solar system not too long ago, 65 million years ago, or in that neighborhood thereabouts. So what Tom did was to analyze, based on that last Russian picture from Phobos, the mysterious cylindrical object. And his conclusion was, based on photometry, which is measurement of light, the brightness of light, that in fact, remember how I said a moment ago that Phobos was very, very dark? It was like 5% reflectivity. It was blacker than coal. The object that the Phobos spacecraft photographed near Phobos, this cylindrical object, turned out to be a time-lapse image of a streak of light by an object near the spacecraft, but the object was not a cylinder. It was basically a time lapse of a much smaller circular object moving across the field of view of the camera when the shutter was open. That's number one. So it wasn't a cylinder. It was actually maybe a fist-sized lump of rock. Number two, and more important, if it was a spacecraft, it would be bright and shiny, right? In fact, the photometrics of the object that was photographed around Phobos turns out to be very dark. It's a very dark, non-reflective object. In fact, the reflectivity of the mysterious object around Phobos was about as dark as Phobos itself. So that implies that it may have been a rock. It may have been something spalled up by an impact on Phobos, still orbiting Mars along with Phobos, which is how the celestial mechanics work. And basically, there was a cloud of smaller objects. And as the Phobos Russian spacecraft approached the moon Phobos, it was one of these smaller debris fields of objects kind of floating in orbit with Phobos that killed the spacecraft because it ran into a rock.
Okay. Well,
So
that's
there's nobody home. I really want to emphasize, as far as I can tell from all the data that we have looked at, from all the missions, all the planetary surfaces, all the artifacts, all the ruins, all the anomalies we found no evidence of anybody except us, the human race, alive in the solar system now. It all appears to be an ancient, preserved ruin waiting for us to reach out and find out who we really finally are.
now a lot of the abduction cases that go on these days and cattle mutilations and such. Do you think that that's possibly our own government and a lot of made up stuff? I mean, do you think that there is some type of contact with an extraterrestrial race now, or you think that there hasn't been? Like you're saying, it's all just, for thousands of years, maybe millions of years, there has been none.
I think it's us. I mean, I've done a lot of work on the abductees, particularly. I don't talk about a lot of this in public because it's not really part of what we were doing, but it's foreshadowing of what we're doing. I'm trying to do extraterrestrial archaeology, and I say often that we don't do UFOs. But I have come in contact over the years with lots of people who have been abducted and who have described the experience, and some of them now believe firmly that it was military, it was black ops, it was intelligence, it was, in other words, human beings masquerading as, bad aliens, to basically keep this wall of imprisonment between us and whatever is going on out there. I mean, suppose real extraterrestrials came to Earth and they landed and they tried to interact with someone. Do you think that anybody in their right mind would run gleefully toward a landed spaceship, given all the horrors that we've been told about from abductions and UFOs and ETs and Whitley Strieber and communion and all of that mythology, which factors into now how people view the sky and view extraterrestrials? In other words, I think the abductions are part of a technique to drive wedges and keep human beings in subjection, to keep us terrified and afraid of whoever's out there, and also to spread propaganda that whatever's out there is so bad we have to basically depend on our own officials to protect us, which again is part of the ongoing mythos that government knows what to do and the rest of us don't.
Right. Right. And it's interesting you bring that up as far as the persona of aliens today. Back in the 80s, there was E.T., Alf, all these happy aliens. And nowadays it's Cloverfield and Independence Day. And, it's interesting. But yeah, let's get back into more of these just amazing anomalies, Richard, like Cydonia. I know that you've got just a ton of information on that. And these pictures that were taken from the Viking orbiter and other satellites from NASA, possibly JPL. And then now you've got rovers on Mars. But Cydonia specifically, I want to talk about it first because everybody's heard of Cydonia that studies Mars and anomalies. And there's these what looks like pyramids and buildings to the I guess you could say, southwest of this famous or infamous Sphinx face. So I was wondering what you could tell us about that and some of the geometrical patterns and numerology associated with these.
Well, as I said in Monuments, remember I've written 2 books, Monuments of Mars, A City on the Edge of Forever, which is our description of the Mars discoveries up to and including things that I found on the moon in the latter years as I was looking at Mars. And then the other book, Dark Mission, is a subsequent book which talks about more recent history. So back when I wrote Monuments of Mars, I was basically working off the Viking data, and the Viking data gave us 2 sets of images of this region on Mars called Cydonia, taken about a month apart, and I go through in elaborate detail in the early chapters of the Monuments of Mars, the discovery, my being at JPL, the questions that were asked, the dismissals, that it was anything interesting but a trick of light and shadow. I then talk about how I went to a conference in Boulder, Colorado, some years later, a science conference, and saw 2 engineering contractors, imaging contractors from, I believe, Lockheed, who had independently gone into the Goddard Space Flight Center files had found the pictures of Mars, found the pictures of Cydonia, had found a second face, a second image of the face on Mars, as I said, taken 30 days after the first image that had been dismissed at this press conference at JPL. And so, as Sherlock Holmes would say, the game's afoot. So now you've got two separate images of this face, right? With one, it could be, as NASA says resolutely for decades, just a trick of light and shadow. But when you got two pictures and they're taken at two different sun angles and you compare them scientifically, point for point and feature for feature, and they turn out to be the same. And then when you have one of your colleagues, which I did, Mark Carlotto, do a three-dimensional shape from shading full 360 rotation of the face, and you find that it is, in fact, a three-dimensional, 1,500-foot high, mile-wide image of a human being lying on Mars, which is how I got into all this. You say to yourself, wait a minute, according to all existing science, that's impossible. A, nobody can live on Mars because NASA's now found that it's dead and died a long time ago. And
do you think that's true? Do you think they're being honest about that?
No, but that's only one of the many, many, many lies we've been told. Remember, if the name of the game is to keep us down on the farm, to keep us isolated on one planet, to keep us thinking this is all there is, then all the information coming from out there has been filtered. It has been skewed to where we're only going to see the natural stuff. We're not going to see any of the artificial stuff. So that's what made the face on Mars such an anomaly, because not only did we have one photograph that NASA grudgingly told us about and said, oh, it's just a trick of light and shadow. In fact, the project scientist, Jerry Soffman, told us flatly that morning in 1976, I think it was July 25th or something of 76 when they showed us that face. He said categorically, when we took a picture a few hours later, it all went away. Now, it turns out that was an absolute bold-faced lie. Why was it a lie? Because you couldn't take a picture of the face on Mars with the Viking spacecraft a few hours later.
Right.
The orbits and the celestial mechanics and all that made that impossible. The actual second picture that was taken, which Molinar and DiPietro found, as I said, the engineers working for Lockheed at Goddard, separately, years later, found that there was a second picture, but it wasn't taken a few hours later. It was taken a month later when the orbits resynchronized, and more critically, it was taken at a different sun angle. Now, it's the sun angle that determines whether you're looking at a trick of light and shadow. When you have two separate images at two different sun angles, with computer technology now, you can put together an exquisite 3D model, which is what Dr. Carlotto did as part of our early science in this area. And it's that separate image which creates the 3D model that allows us to say categorically the face on Mars was not, is not, cannot be a trick of light and shadow. It's a real three-dimensional structure with that morphology, that geometry, that appearance. And obviously somebody made it because of the symmetries in the internal geometry, and they made it in our likeness. And that's, of course, telling us something huge. And then, of course, I go on for a presentation at the UN to find that the face on Mars actually is two faces. The left-hand side is humanoid or anthropoid or looks something like us, probably a much more primitive us. The right-hand side, when you look at the face on Mars from the Viking images, looks like a lion, a feline image, a total non-primate. So what you've got in the face on Mars is a fusion of two artistic images, and one is hominid and one is feline, and there's got to be a reason why the incredible artists who created this, with engineering that's totally beyond us, of course, why that message was intended to last down through time. What could whoever built the city at Cydonia and the face on Mars have been intending by communicating a message of the fusion of a hominid species and a feline species? That, to me, is an overwhelming question yet to be answered and satisfied.
Well, and it sounds like the Sphinx in Egypt, they merged the two.
Exactly.
There's
exactly.
some spiritual or metaphysical connection there, some symbologically speaking.
Well, why would you say metaphysical or spiritual?
Hey,
To me, when you see two species fused together, it says genetic engineering.
There you go. Okay. Yeah.
Okay, yeah. So we've got a feline genes and we've got hominid genes, and someone in the model of the face on Mars is to tell us this. Someone fused these two genes together to create a third species. Now that's an astonishing message, if that's the message we should be reading. So then you go to a very obscure, totally obscure piece of popular trivia in the 1950s here on Earth, which is a Viewmaster reel put together by producers in Hollywood with the help of a German science writer, German space writer named Willy Ley. In the 1950s, early 50, 51, Willy Ley was part of a project to do the pilot for the Saturday morning TV show. I forget whether it was on CBS or ABC, Tom Corbett Space Cadet. And in this Viewmaster reel, which was a kind of a pilot for the Tom Corbett Space Cadet TV series, which was in black and white, of course, in this color Viewmaster reel, you see very clearly Tom Corbett goes to Mars, finds an ancient civilization marked by a feline head. It then directs him to the asteroid belt. He then takes his crew to the asteroid belt. They go inside an asteroid kind of looking like Phobos, and they find the remains of an ancient super civilization. And the civilization was basically run by, created by, organized by, and utilized by, benefited by an alien race of giant, wait for it, pussycats. Huge feline alien beings. 1951, Tom Corbett Space Cadet. 1976, Viking photographs huge feline hominid face on Mars. Rex, do you think someone knows something that the rest of us don't know, and they've been trying to tell us for a long, long time?
Oh, absolutely, without a shadow of a doubt. And that also makes me think that when this giant catastrophe that caused possibly an entire solar system or even beyond that to almost be completely destroyed where just a few people survived, I'll bet you that there was a break-off society even back then, in my opinion, and who knows where they are now. Maybe they're in a completely different dimension. Maybe, I don't know. But I wonder, and I think that there's...
But Rex,
yeah.
the thing is we can find out. All we have to do is go and find the libraries.
Yeah, right.
When you try to reconstruct solar system history, you try to reconstruct terrestrial history, beyond a few thousand years, you're basically back to rocks, right? You're reconstructing the history of the planet based on the rocks, the record in the rocks. In this case, we don't have to wait to decode that record, which is not going to tell us about anything artificial anyway. We can find the libraries. And if this ancient, incredibly advanced civilization was at least as advanced in information technology as we are, and of course, I'm being really kind of droll when I say that.
Right.
We know there's going to be vast nodes of electronic connection libraries all over the solar system. All we have to do is find one that's working, and we'll have the entire history of what came before us and who we are and what happened to the solar system all at once, like a huge super mega hit movie, all in one place. All we got to do is find that one place, and NASA may be trying to find that one place with their missions, but they're not telling the rest of us.
Well, and maybe they already have. And like you said...
You mean found it?
Yeah.
Yes, totally. I totally agree. They may have found it. They may have found it in the most incredibly unexpected form. Do you remember me showing some years ago a photograph from the moon, from the Apollo missions, from Apollo 17, of a very remarkable object lying in a crater called Shorty Crater near the Apollo 17 landing site on the moon?
Please refresh my memory.
The robotic head, Data's head, C-3PO.
Oh, yes. And I'm so this is totally, I was just about to ask, this is syncing with what I was about to ask about androids. And I'm wondering if they possibly might have had something to do with this civil war. So sorry.
Okay, great setup. So let's continue. When Gene Cernan and Harrison Schmitt, two guys, two astronauts landed on the moon on Apollo 17 in December of 1972. They took a rover with them. Remember the big rover, the Boeing, little
Yeah.
car, and they drove miles around the Valley of Taurus Littrow, picking up rocks and documenting geology and all that. And they visited a crater called Shorty Crater. And they took tons and tons of pictures, and all of those images are now on the official NASA website. So all you have to do is to go and Google Apollo 17 NASA websites, and you'll see thousands of incredible high-resolution color images from the Apollo 17 mission. About a dozen of those images were taken as a panoramic sequence around this Shorty crater. And in the bottom of the crater, on all of these images, remember I said before we had 2 images of the face on Mars?
Yep.
We have like a dozen images of the head, the robot head in the bottom of Shorty crater. This object, this feature, which is not a rock, has eyes, eye sockets. It has lens-like geometry inside the eye sockets, looking like they were some kind of multifaceted telescopic lenses as opposed to eyeballs. Kind of detail you'd never put on a statue. It also has a very symmetrical C-3PO looking visage. It kind of does look like C-3PO. All right, now C-3PO is the anthropoid robot in Star Wars, which takes us back to George Lucas.
Yeah.
Which takes us back to what does Lucas know? Because there is a real dead, preserved, incredibly interesting C-3PO head on the moon photographed by the Apollo 17 astronauts. And when you put them together, because you can composite images to build up signal to noise, and we've got a dozen images. So I put a couple together just to see if I could bring up more detail. And yes, we did. And yes, you can find this on the Enterprise Mission website. Just go to enterprisemission.com and just, or you can Google Data's Head Enterprise Mission. It will take you to the article, take you to our analysis, take you to the images, to the comparisons. There appears to have been a real robot head on the moon found by the Apollo astronauts. And we don't know tonight, Rex, whether they brought it home. And if they brought it home, how long did it take for them to wake it up?
Right.
How long did it take for them to be able to tap into its memories? Could it, in fact, have been, given that robotic technology will evolve in this way on Earth, could, in fact, one robot found, if the head is in perfect shape, it hasn't been physically damaged, and you can re-energize it, put electricity back in, that's all you do, bingo, there you have your node to the intergalactic library of this ancient super high civilization that remodeled this solar system and then died in some incredible tragic catastrophe, which may have been a great war. And now we get to Glenn Larson and we get to Battlestar Galactica.
Yeah, yep.
And we get to that perspective on our history. So in fact, are we really a composite of the Star Wars mythos and the Battlestar Galactica mythos? And is C-3PO on the moon, or Data's head on the moon found by Apollo 17, the key to all of this?
Well, and
did we learn in those 40 years since Apollo, did we learn how to talk to it? And is that secretly inside the reason we're seeing lots of interesting changes around the world, including 195 nations all coming together in Paris over so-called climate warming, but in fact, those 195 nations, are they in fact sharing data on a coming revelation of who we really are?
Right. And it's interesting, too, you're bringing up that event in Paris, and just before that event of all the nations gathering together, There was the Bataclan attacks, and just, wow, very strange coincidence there. But so we're talking about possibly, C-3PO type android head on the moon. And I remember seeing that picture. It blew my mind.
And do you remember one of the key factors of the head? What was the thing that really made it obvious that it couldn't be a rock?
Well, it was like the eyeball things. It was like just the shapes of kind of like this multi-dimensional eye socket eyeball thing that I'm thinking of that was very android looking.
It had basically iris eyes, like camera eyes, as opposed to organic eyeballs. Who in their right mind, what process, what force can create symmetry and iris-like eyes on a piece of rock on the moon at random?
It's just swamp gas, Richard. But I gotta say too, we're talking about all these similarities of Star Wars, and I just got to plug one more thing. Several years ago, there was some really cool news articles that came out about how some divers found like this spaceship thing in the Caribbean somewhere. It was either the Caribbean or Bahamas, and then it just got real hush hush. Military went out there, they closed everything off, but there was some infrared images.
No, that wasn't what it was. It was Paulina Zalitsky, who was an oceanographer from Canada who got a contract with Fidel Castro to do deep diving off the western coast of Cuba.
Okay, thank you.
And they found this ancient pyramid city a half a mile down on the ocean floor where nothing like that should ever be. And then all news vanished.
Well, what I was referring to, and that's actually something that's awesome too, but there was a few years ago, and I'll double check my reference points here, but they found this like spaceship looking thing on the bottom of the ocean, but it wasn't. They did an infrared photography on it. It looked just like the Millennium Falcon. Literally, it had the same outline.
No. I know what you're talking about. Look, there's so much, Rex. You'll be forgiven for conflating the two stories because there's too much to keep track of. That was the object found under the Baltic Sea.
Baltic Sea.
A couple years ago, and you can't do infrared underwater, but they did sonar.
Sonar.
They found it with sonar, and it looks like the Millennium Falcon. Yes, geometrically, it looks like the Millennium Falcon. And it even seems to have a kind of a groove across the seabed where whatever came in slid and left a big slosh mark in the sediments on the bottom of the Baltic Sea, very similar to the marks that were left around the Titanic when it splashed into the sediments, back in 1912 after it sank in its maiden voyage. So yeah, there's something unusual under the Baltic Sea, which looks to be anomalous, maybe technological. It looks kind of like maybe a spaceship. We don't know. And again, all news in the news media, all connections, all discussion of that anomaly has disappeared. So let me get back to C-3PO on the moon for a moment. The one huge significator which tells me that we're dealing with an artificial object is there's a big red stripe under his chin. What rocks on the moon do you know that have red stripes painted on them under their chin?
Right.
So no. Now, here's the huge question. Did the Apollo 17 astronauts, did Cernan and Schmidt, go down into that crater, pick up C-3PO's head, and bring it home? And did it take them 40 years, them meaning NASA, the government, the NSA, every expert on the planet brought to bear on how to decode what was in the computer memory? Did they finally figure out how to, A, turn it on, and B, how to talk to it? And what has it told them? And is that in part a reason for some of the peculiar things going on around the planet geopolitically right now?
Oh, I can certainly imagine the possibilities. That's amazing and incredible to think about. And that also makes me wonder too, remember a few years ago, NASA bomb to the moon.
No. They were thinking of.
Well, they sent a missile out there or something, didn't they, to find water?
No. They're all right. Back in the 1950s and 60s, Sagan was involved in a project to literally, because we were in this rush with the Russians, in this race, and we wanted to basically prove our superiority. There were people in the DOD, in the Defense Department, who actually thought we should send a nuclear, atomic bomb to the moon, detonate it to basically make a statement. Thank God that never happened. But there have been a lot of other spacecraft now in the last few years which have gone into orbit. There's the lunar observer, um, lunar orbiter, and what it does is it takes high resolution images of the entire surface now. So we now know the moon much better than we ever did, but unfortunately, those images have not been published yet. NASA has seen them, and the rest of us haven't.
Right. Yeah. It wasn't a missile. It wasn't a nuclear missile. It was just a satellite they
Yep.
sent in 2009 to kick up some dust to supposedly find water.
If we have a moon, 22,000, 160 miles across, which is the size of the moon, quarter the size of the Earth,
Right.
and it's orbiting a 250,000 miles away, if it's really a gas station, if it's got all kinds of volatiles, all kinds of things we can use to explore and ultimately colonize space, why would you not want to send a spacecraft to inventory its materials? That's what LaCrosse was. The idea was to send a spacecraft to the polar regions, the South Polar region, because given the way the moon orbits the Earth and its angle to the sun, in terms of obliquity, which is, how it spins, is it straight up and down or does it have a tilt? The poles of the moon, there are places on the poles of the moon that never ever now see sunlight, which means they get very, very, very cold, like down almost to absolute zero. It's now been found by the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter mission that the poles of the moon are actually colder, Rex, than Pluto. There are parts of the moon in permanent shadow which are lower in temperature, closer to absolute zero than even the surface of Pluto in sunlight. That's how dramatic it is. When you take away external energy, things in space get very, very, very cold. So the theory was, if you have cold traps, as they're called, at the poles of the moon, North and South Pole, it's possible that you will have trapped water in those cold traps over the history of the solar system. Again, looking at a conventional model of the solar system, because we're talking NASA now. And if that's true, if you send a spacecraft to the poles and you find the water inventory will tell you how easy it will be to build bases and colonies and cities on the moon. If you don't have to import water, if water is there, water is most of what we're made of, right?
Right.
Water is most of what agriculture depends on. Water is what culture and civilization and life depend on. So if you find a source of water on the moon that's already there, you will have done an extraordinary thing in terms of advancing development, colonization, plans for cities, plans for bases, plans for human occupation. So the LaCrosse mission, which was sent to the moon, I think in 2009, if I'm not mistaken,
Right.
was designed to crash land at a spacecraft, actually the upper stage of the Centaur rocket, at the South Pole of the moon, in a crater, in a deep crater which never sees sunlight now. And a second spacecraft carried by that rocket would be detached just before impact, and the spacecraft, before it impacted, would record and transmit to Earth all the data from the first impact, including the spalling up or the cratering up or the splashing up of ice and chunks of rock and rubble and dust. And they hope to get the spectral fingerprint of water from the ice chunks thrown up into sunlight by the impact before the spacecraft actually crashed into the moon itself. And all of that worked as advertised. And they found all kinds of bizarre stuff, Rex. But here's what was so absolutely, totally unbelievable. The LaCrosse mission, smashing a spacecraft into the South Pole of the moon to see if there was indigenous water on the surface, found not only water, they found a whole range of other elements, but the most remarkable element that no one can explain, in fact, no one even addresses, they found an equivalent amount of mercury. The liquid metal mercury, equivalent to the amount of water that they found. So they found the equivalent of billions of tons of water at the South Pole of the moon. They also found the equivalent of billions of tons of mercury, liquid metal mercury, at the South Pole of the moon. And mercury is not a major naturally occurring element. It doesn't exist in abundance in the crust of the Earth and the crust of any other planet. This is such an anomaly that nobody is talking about. But mercury is a major component of very exotic high technology systems, including, if you read the Indian Vedas and the Indian Vedic traditions going back thousands of years, talking about a previous high tech civilization on Earth, mercury was the operative material that made the Vimanas, the anti gravity spacecraft of this previous high tech civilization, reported by the Indian Vimanas in their histories, in their chronicles, in their myths, as having existed. And so mercury is a critical component for any major civilization that wants to go into space. And isn't it incredibly weird that we found as much liquid mercury at the bottom south pole of the moon as we found water? To me, that's telling us something overwhelmingly profound.
Yeah, that's incredible. And it also brings me to the next question. Correct me if I'm wrong here, but many years ago, when we had people on the moon and they brought some rocks back, the compound was basically like a titanium alloy mixture. Is that correct? Yeah.
Titanium is incredibly abundant in what are called the mare. When you look at the moon on a full moon night, you see light areas and dark areas. The light areas are very light rocks. They are rich in aluminum, they're rich in silicates, they're rich in magnesium compounds. The dark areas, the so called seas of the moon, they're rich in iron compounds, they're rich in basalts, which is a very heavy black volcanic rock, which has a lot of iron in it, which comes up out of the earth all over. Hawaii basically is made of basalt. The fact is that there are titanium rich rocks or titanium rich samples. We probably should call them samples and not rocks, because they may not be rocks. They may be the end product of the mining and manufacturing, refining manufacturing of titanium for structural use on the moon. And the fact that we're only finding titanium bearing stuff in the mare and not in the highlands of the moon tells me that maybe the ancient cities on the moon, now totally destroyed because of this interplanetary war that bombarded every planet with incredible amounts of debris, which would have sandblasted everything into oblivion. The dark areas of the lunar seas might in fact mark the titanium-rich foundations of the ancient vast cities on the moon that we no longer even can see or even envision because they've been so thoroughly destroyed by the after effects of that war.
And also, I had an opportunity to speak with Alan Sturm. He's got a website called Lunar Anomalies. I think you've actually spoken with him before on your radio program, haven't you?
You mean Alan Stern, STRN? He's the principal investigator of the New Horizons mission. Alan Sturm, STURM, is an architect who's part of our imaging team at the Enterprise mission and Other Side of Midnight.
Okay, well,
one letter. N versus M. Alan Stern, STRN, is the principal investigator of the New Horizons mission. Yes, I had him as a guest on my live Pluto special, 6-hour Pluto special, as the New Horizons spacecraft flew by. We talked to almost everybody in the astronomical community connected to the discovery of Pluto, including Clyde Tombaug's son. So if you want to get to the archive for this Pluto special, you go to othersideofmidnight.com, you click on the archive, Club 19.5. That's our archive. In fact, that's where I plan to put this recording of this show at some point, if you will let me, because I think that you're a very good interviewer. I think you've done your homework. You're asking really cool questions, and I like my audience in Club 19.5 to have access to what we talk about. But anyway, if you go back to our archive and you listen to that 6-hour broadcast on Pluto, the Pluto Encounter, July 14th, last summer, July 14th in 2015, exactly 50 years after Mariner 4 went by Mars. I did this special with my friend and colleague Dick Bertel. We interviewed everybody up to and including Alan Stern on live air, where he said, Rex, take note of this, he said on live air that morning, Pluto has a science fiction surface. What the hell did he mean by that?
That's a good question. What did he mean
Huh?
by that?
Well, I think it was a leak. It was a major leak between the lines. Hoagland, you're right. Just keep looking, keep pressing, keep asking
Nice.
questions. Pluto has a science fiction surface. What scientist ever in the history of astronomy has ever said any planet has a science fiction surface?
None that I recall.
Nope. But when you look at the incredible high resolution detailed imagery from New Horizons, and for that, you now have to go to another website, not Enterprise Mission, because I've frankly been too busy doing my radio show to put together a decent paper on the New Horizons mission. So I'm going to refer you over to Keith Laney's website, hiddenmission.com. Go to hiddenmission.com. Just look for all the Pluto headlines, Pluto Boneyard, Pluto this, Pluto that, and just look at those images. Look at them carefully. Look at what Keith has written with our input, all our inputs. We're looking at Pluto, Rex, at an artificial set of structures, miles and miles and miles of glittering glass enclosures, now, of course, in ruin, incredibly degraded because of age and time and bombardment. But they're the best preserved ruins of anything we have found anywhere in the solar system. And I frankly think, and I said this in a book that I published before the Pluto arrival, in March of 2015, my old publisher, North Atlantic Books, published a book called Pluto New Horizons for a Lost Horizon, where I laid out predictions for what we would find on Pluto. And what I predicted we would find on Pluto is what we found on Pluto. And that's really important because science is nothing if it's not prediction. So we predicted this. Stern obviously had read this. He knew where I was thinking. So on the show that morning, he gives me this interesting coded line: Pluto has a science fiction surface. And the reason, I think, is because Pluto is in this amazingly highly inclined orbit, 17 degrees, which, by the way, is not a random number. 17 is very important mythologically in terms of hyperdimensional physics and all that. And that highly inclined orbit has allowed Pluto to survive the sandblasting that all the other bodies in the solar system have been subjected to, because it only comes down through the plane of the solar system, twice every orbit. And since the orbit of Pluto is roughly 248 years, roughly half of that, I mean, it's not a circular orbit, so it's not equally divided, but like every 125 years or so, it goes down for a few days through the ring plane of the solar system, which means its exposure to this sandblasting from the incredible amount of debris that the explosion of Planet 5 put into the, Planet 4 put into the solar system back when it was blown to smithereens. That has not destroyed as much the stuff on Pluto or in the Plutonian system, those 5 so-called moons. I'm now beginning to think, Rex, that Pluto was put in orbit specifically as an archive, put in that inclined orbit as an archive, with things orbiting around it as other parts of the archive, including a pristine version of one of the arcologies in orbit that we see in multiple sets on the surface of Pluto in what we call arcology row. And again, all of this is listed in great detail on Keith Laney's website, hiddenmission.com. Simply go to hiddenmission.com and look up all the Pluto stuff and enjoy and enjoy and enjoy.
And it's fascinating, too, when you think about these ancient structures that were built to such extremes, millions, tens of millions, hundreds of thousands, just a long, long time ago. Like, it's awesome. It's absolutely amazing. And it makes me think that just the whole perception on our solar system is completely wrong. We're taught to think that it's, planets away from Earth are just not inhabitable, but clearly the signs show that they are based upon this evidence. And I wonder sometimes, why did we stop sending people to the moon? Do you think it was because they found too much stuff, or what happened?
You want the long answer or the short answer?
Hey, I'd love to have either one of them. If you,
Well, we got so much else to cover, and we've only got about 25 minutes left in the show.
Yeah.
So the short answer is yes. We stopped going to the moon because it became too dangerous, because the American people and the rest of the planet would get wind of what's really there. NASA couldn't continue the cover up, so we had to stop going. Now, they've given us all kinds of excuses oh, we're concerned the technology would fail, and oh, we were concerned we would lose astronauts. No, they were concerned that they would be found out. And they got, with Apollo 17, they went to, do you know that Apollo 17 landed at 19.5 on the moon? Now,
Wow.
19.5, for those who are not familiar, is a key number in hyperdimensional physics. You find it again and again and again. It's the inscribed tetrahedral angle of the energy waves going on inside the sun, every star, the planets, whatever. It creates energy which comes up at the surface at 19.5 degrees on planets and on the sun during the peak of the sunspot cycle. The peak sunspot latitude is about 19.5 degrees. And you see over and over and over NASA launching and landing spacecraft when, angles in the sky, angles with the sun, angles with other celestial bodies is 19.5 degrees. So that is kind of one of these symbolic watchwords. Well, that latitude is the latitude of the landing site of Apollo 17 within a tenth of a degree. Do you remember a couple 3 years ago in 2013 when the Chinese landed their first robotic spacecraft on the moon?
Yes, I do.
You remember where they landed?
No.
44 north and change. That's latitude, and 19.5 degrees west longitude. In other words, totally symbolic. There's nothing physically where they landed that would be unusual geophysically, but they landed politically, symbolically, to reinforce the idea of 19.5 to everybody who knows what that means, who's looking on that mission. So yeah, the Chinese are fully aware on all this, up on all this, and they obviously are proceeding with their moon program. Do you know their next plan is to land a spacecraft on the far side of the moon?
Now that would be fantastic because that's probably where the real gems are on the moon.
Funny you should say that because it's true. And the reason it's true is not because folks are parking things on the far side so we can't see them. Near side, far side, the moon rotates once a month, so there's a side we get to see and a side we don't get to see. No, the far side of the moon is also the place where stuff is much less destroyed because of that ancient bombardment. Something has happened with the moon in the last X million years since the war, 65 million years. And the moon is now orbiting the Earth, looking at the Earth in a way it did not look at the Earth back then. In other words, I think if you were to look at the moon when the solar system was still the way it had been modified, when there was an incredibly thriving, high-tech Type 2 civilization all throughout it, I think if you'd been on the Earth looking up at the moon, you would not have seen the familiar features of the moon we see tonight. The moon would have been rotated to the left by 90 degrees, meaning that the face that we see of the moon actually was 90 degrees to the left, meaning it was the facing side of the moon as the moon orbits around the Earth. And it was that facing side that got hit by all the debris. Remember, two cars colliding head on? And
Right.
the trailing side would have been much more protected. And then when that 90-degree rotation occurred, for whatever reason, it might have been the impact that caused Mare Orientale to form on the moon in the southern hemisphere at 19.5 degrees. If you want to kill a planet, if you want to kill a civilization, you want to destroy it utterly so nothing survives, you hit it at one of these energy points. And somebody apparently directed an impact at 19.5 south, which created Mare Orientale, which is a basin on the moon which is thousands of miles wide. And the eruptions, the external eruptions after things had occurred in the center of the moon from the input of all that enormous energy came up and created many of the dark seas that we see now as the ancient, face of the man on the moon. Those are the imprints of the ancient cities in my model reconstruction, and everything was shifted 90 degrees to the right. So the far side of the moon now was really the backside of the moon then, meaning it was protected from a lot of destruction. So if the Chinese are now going from a landing on the front side of the moon at 19.5 to a landing on the far side of the moon, these are all robots now, Is it possible it's because they now know they figured out what I figured out based on what they found, and they now know the good stuff, the preserved stuff, may be on the far side, and that's why they're going there?
Well, and there's a few other questions I'm going to bring up about the moon. There's a lot of speculation that it could possibly be artificial. There's evidence, I guess, that points to it being somewhat hollow. If that's true, correct me, or correct me if I'm wrong there. And also,
yeah. The evidence that's indicating it's hollow is wrong. Let me start with square one.
Great.
All right, I agree. The moon is probably it isn't artificial. Unlike Iapetus, which I think is completely remade. Our Iapetus is a spacecraft, a 900-mile wide spacecraft with lots of space inside. I think the moon is natural, meaning it has a core, it has a mantle, it has a crust, it's had normal planetary development. It was brought here from somewhere else by this incredible high-tech civilization. It was then placed in orbit around the Earth as a means of creating a favorable environment for advanced life, because we now know that without the moon, life on Earth would be impossible. I believe it was brought here about 500 to 600 million years ago, a little over 500 million years ago. That's when I think the whole solar system was remodeled and remade. That's when the cosmic engineers, as I've dubbed this invisible, incredibly advanced civilization, came here and decided to create another garden so that life intelligence could develop and flourish and evolve and find out what it was supposed to do. And if that's true, if all that's true, then the experiment with conscious life in the solar system came to an incredibly tragic benchmark because we had the war. In other words, conscious beings, high spiritually connected beings, for some reason went to war with absolutely gargantuan, world-changing weaponry, which managed to destroy one, left the solar system, this rearranged solar system for life, in ruins. And now we have to go and pick up the pieces and figure out what went wrong, and I guess which side we wound up on.
Right. Well,
because we're not very conscious, are we? As a species, are we conscious? No.
As the overall human archetype, I would definitely say no. I do think that there are certain individuals like yourself and other listeners to this broadcast that really are awake and have a higher level of consciousness. And Richard, that brings me to the next thing. I almost feel as if your consciousness equates to your spark or your spirit essence. Everything is information at some level. So it's as if the more information you gain, the more your conscious evolves and the more you become spiritually. Would you agree with that?
That's not a bad idea. That's not a bad metric, as they used to call it, a way to measure things. It's really all about your connectedness. And again, the connectedness of consciousness, of spirit, of who we really are, I think goes hand in hand with the physics. Remember, if physics is part of consciousness, and a high physics is more high, meaning you have more connection to non-three-dimensional information, who you really are, your virtual self. Think of us in this three-dimensional playground as kind of meet robots. And when you die, you don't die. No, you don't die. You just go back to source. You just go back. Your consciousness goes back to where you really are. This is merely a virtual reality projection of your consciousness working a meat robot to have fun in a 3D reality. So if that's all true, and the degree of connectedness of consciousness to the real source of who you are depends on the physics, when the solar system was attacked in this war, and major parts of it destroyed, like a whole planet, the physics as a whole collapsed to such a small fraction that it could not maintain the connectedness of high consciousness of the survivors on Earth, which is why we appear so incredibly primitive. We've been cut off. The war may have been, going back to why, the war may have been created by our antagonist, our opponents, our opposition, the enemy, whoever we want to call it, to basically kill our consciousness, to keep us now trapped as meat prisoners on a terrestrial planet in three-dimensional reality without any real means to reliably connect back to who we really are until we die.
Yeah, that's a real powerful way and eloquent way to present it. I like that. And hopefully, things will continue to improve with just awareness, and we'll go from there. But
well, see, the good news is, if we're looking at consciousness as a marker of the physics of higher dimensional connection, what we now know from my measurements, the Accutron measurements, and we know from lots and lots of records of ancient peoples and Aboriginal peoples all over the world and their construction of sacred sites and pyramids and other complexes, we now know that there is a technology that we can create that will amplify locally the physics, which then can amplify locally our connection back to who we really are. And you can do that with instrumentality. You don't have to remodel an entire solar system. So it's very possible that the cultures that built all these massive pyramids all over the world, up and down the Nile Valley, in the western part of China, in the Yucatan, in Central America, in India, all over, that the building of pyramids was in fact an effort to create a solid state hyperdimensional amplifier that would allow more communication, thinking of it just as Shannon information theory. How do you communicate from source to receiver and back? Those structures may be, from our measurements, amplifiers of this ability for us to connect to higher dimensions, to who we really are. And that may, in fact, presage the times when the physics itself changes. It goes up and down. And we're now approaching one of those up periods where more conscious people are being born, more conscious people are being restive, are being aggressive, are being they're not playing sheep. They're basically making a lot of noise, because in this brief window, if we seize this window, we can reconnect in the physics to who we really are, and we can transform civilization and humanity that way. But in that model, we only got a small window, and it's like carpe diem. It seize the day, and if we don't, we may have to wait another long period of time, tens of thousands of years, maybe the precessional cycle, 25, 9, 20 years before the physics syncs up again to when consciousness can try again to break out of prison.
There's these, we talk about different civilizations, like a type 1 society, type 2, 3, etc. I think it goes all the way up to 5, correct, in that scale?
Well, it's kind of arbitrary.
Sure.
Kardashev's original type 3 types had to do with energy.
Okay.
A lot of us now, subsequent to Kardashev, who, by the way, was a student of Shklovsky, the guy who thought Phobos was hollow. It's all connected. Like I had the incredible opportunity the other night to interview James Burke. You know about James Burke?
Great guy.
Oh, super. But his model of science, it's all ultimately connected, is absolutely not embraced by an awful lot of scientists because, well, probably because of power. If they were to share data and implications with other fields, other disciplines, it would reduce their importance. But in fact, all sciences are connected. So all the stuff we've talked about ultimately has connections, and the art form is to try to move the connections in the direction where you get more advancement, more knowledge, more breakthroughs, and particularly on the political front, as consciousness is changing. Remember, I've said, don't know whether you've heard me say over and over again over the last several years, that as the physics is changing, the good are getting better and the bad are getting worse. Remember that?
Right.
Okay. Last night, as I'm waiting to do an interview on ABC in Los Angeles, I'm just kind of flipping through the channels, and they're running Captain America, the first Avenger, again. Yeah. So I kind of, sit there. I'm waiting, nothing else to do. I know what I'm going to say. So I'm kind of watching Captain America. And however many times you watch these movies, you always miss something. Because there's a session kind of midway through the film where, remember the German scientist who would develop this incredibly enhancing serum that turned, Steve Rogers into a superhero?
Yep.
He gives him the injection, and then he's talking about, what will happen and why he was selected. He wasn't the best soldier. He wasn't the most aggressive. He didn't have the killer instinct. He was a good man. And what this German scientist in the film says to Steve Rogers, sitting, two bunk beds side by side, and they're holding glasses of schnapps because they're going to toast to his experiment the following day. He says, but Doc, why me? And he says, because this creates the context where the good get great and the bad get worse. In other words, in the Marvel film, Captain America is the central premise of hyperdimensional torsion field physics, that if you increase this connection to source, not only physically does it improve you, the metaphor of the superhuman, Steve Rogers, but it also reaches deep into your soul and it magnifies the intrinsic qualities of you as a human being. The good will become great. Right there in those two lines is the encapsulation of our physics, our research, what we think happened, what we think is going on now, and what we think can happen if we can reconnect humanity with source and do it by understanding this physics and overcoming the horrible, shattering after effects of the Great War.
Right. And, with this virtual reality type simulation that we seem to be in called life, it's definitely real, but if you look at physical matter at a electron microscope, you can't get to that finite point. It's just protons, neutrons, and electrons oscillating in different frequencies. So essentially,
and ultimately, it may all be fields. It all may be
right.
fields of force. Matter, as we think we know it, may not exist at all. It's all changeable fields of force
Mm-hmm.
in a matrix.
Yeah. Red
Does that
pill
sound familiar?
or blue pill, Neo?
Mm-hmm. We could not, Rick, we could not have had this conversation even 5 or 10 years ago.
Right.
You know why? Because
Just
all of the popular culture stuff that's out there that I think is being put out there deliberately by high conscious beings. Oh my God, he just said Hollywood is high consciousness. I think there are light workers involved in these industries, and they're all coming together now, either consciously or unconsciously, to create these windows of our real history, our real reality, who we really are. And we're interpreting them because we're sold them as fiction. But if you understand the fiction is a fiction and you start looking at what they're showing us and the relationships, they're showing us a reality where this physics, this force, this reality, this knowledge, this science, this high level of connectedness was never lost.
Yeah, that's a good point. It's always been in the subconscious, within the imagination, and these different movies that are presented today do give people, different possibilities, and I think that's incredible. And I also know, based upon scientific studies that have been done, if somebody sees something happen, like if you watch somebody get in a car accident, the part of your mind that's activated is the same part of the mind that's activated when somebody's in that car accident. So by creating these blockbuster films with, possibly information from our past, previous ancestors, etc., bringing it to the conscious level, it's like we're reliving that and creating it and connecting at a higher level. So it's incredible.
You touched on something so important, because what is that process also doing? If we ourselves, individuals, you
Creating.
and me, if we have our own blocks and we don't remember our previous lives, I mean, the obvious conclusion is some of us now on planet Earth, writers, producers, directors, the people in the communications industry in Hollywood, in the business of storytelling, of myth making, suppose those people are tapping further into their archetypal memories from when they lived prior to 65 million years ago in this type 2 civilization all over the solar system, and they watched and experienced themselves the whole culture die. In other words, are we seeing reincarnative flashes presented to us on the big screen as fiction, but in fact, it's only buried memories of who we really are? Well, think about it. Think of all these great writers, the people that we follow, the people that we've read, the people that molded my childhood and probably yours, people like Asimov and Clarke and Heinlein, and the list goes on and on. And now, of course, we got Roddenberry and Lucas, and all the great myth makers. Are they trying to tell us without maybe even themselves knowing who we really are? And as the physics changes and the veil thins, and we can get more information from these higher dimensional sources, is in fact this imprinting becoming stronger and stronger? And at some point, will there be a breakthrough and everybody says, oh my God, it wasn't fiction, it's who we are?
Well, and that makes me think of something else too. There was recently an article that came out about a satellite that, or actually, I'm sorry, not a satellite, but a telescope that is under its prototype right now sessions, but it can basically see things that the physical eye can't see. I mean, we're only picking up 0.01% of the electromagnetic light spectrum, and our brain filters out at least 50% of that oftentimes. So we see a very limited amount of what's actually out there. And these telescopes are picking up a lot of these just really weird anomalies, and a lot of them are happening around military bases. And I'm wondering if there's something behind the scenes that kind of orchestrates certain events and kind of influences people, and what your thought is on that.
Okay. Recently on Sci-Fi, in the last few weeks, literally at the end of 2015, an extraordinary novel by a very dear friend of mine, Arthur C. Clarke, finally made it to the screen, to television. Childhood's End.
Great
did you ever read
series.
the book? Basically what Childhood's End says, and remember, Arthur wrote it in 1951, the same year that the Tom Corbett stuff came out. Okay? That's when we were supposed to have the breakthrough. And then something happened and everybody closed the doors. They slammed the doors shut. And we've been living in this artificial, no, you're not supposed to know your history world for decades and decades and decades. Well, I find it really remarkable, again, coincidental, that in the final weeks of 2015, Childhood's End finally made it to television, 3 nights. What's the basic thesis of Arthur's Childhood's End? I mean, the very title is what it says.
Right.
Childhood's End is when you put away childish things and you become different. You morph into an adult. You become, not only do you have more information available, but you have a better mechanism to process and analyze the information, so you have more context, so you understand the meaning. That novel, I believe, was a metaphor in Arthur's mind for what ultimately had to come. I think Arthur was one of the insiders. I think Arthur knew a lot of this stuff, and that a lot of the things that he made up and he wrote as fiction, in fact, is not. And he knew it was not, because he was one of those rare people that knew he was remembering. And the reason I know that, well, that's a whole other show. I had a personal interaction with Arthur one time, and it really made me think that he was one of those who was remembering he was remembering. And that's where some of this incredible insight came from. Anyway, bottom line, in Childhood's End, what happens? What creates the maturization of our species? It's the appearance, the showing up of another extraterrestrial species that then acts as our mentors, moves in to solve certain physical problems to create a context for the advancement and evolution, the resumption of the evolution of the human species in terms of its ultimate consciousness direction. I think, taking from the film and from the novel to the present, that in fact could be going on right now, and we may find that we are dealing at some level with the overlords within maybe the next year.
Spooky series. I didn't have the opportunity to read the book. I should, because I'm sure it's
You've got to go back and read the book. Read the book, yes. It's original sources. Always go and read original sources. And then you compare the book and the film. But if my model is correct and your question is correct, that we might be being manipulated around the edges by some other power or powers, if in fact we're so incredibly primitive because we've devolved so far that we basically only care about eating king, and I guess I can say that on the air, and a couple other things.
It's
and
true.
We really need to get our consciousness elevated to where we reconnect with the important things of life, it may need a midwife to help us through this transition, this crisis. Because can you imagine the psychosis of most of the human race when they discover that everything they think they know is wrong? You can't do that to people overnight. You can't do that in an instant. It takes, as Brookings said, a coordinated decades-long program of education. And since we're now out of time, my final thought is we may be living now through that time of transition, and in the next year, we may actually find out for real that this is childhood's end.
No, I'll tell you, if that is the end for humankind, childhood's end.
No. Childhood's end, not the end of humankind. The end of childhood. It's not the same. Not anywhere near the same.
I sure hope not, because like I said, I haven't read the book, but in the series, in the 3-part series, I guess I'll be a spoiler alert here for those that haven't seen it. But
I haven't seen it, so don't do that.
Okay, I will not. I'm not going to tell you. Watch the series. Tell me how it correlates to the book. I'd really like to hear it. And I got to tell you, Richard, you are just awesome, man. I've always loved your work. Your energy is fantastic, and I really appreciate you spending some time with us here today at the Leak Project. I know you're a very busy person, so please give our listeners your website and your radio show before you go, so if they can listen to you in the future. And I hope you'll come on again with us sometime.
Well, through an extraordinary coincidence, or was it not a coincidence, is Art Bell really one of the good guys behind the scenes architecting? Art Bell put me on the air. Art Bell gave me a global international radio show 5 nights a week. You can find me on othersideofmidnight.com. Just go to othersideofmidnight.com. We're digital. We're on certain terrestrial radio stations. We're on shortwave. And we have a global audience, and we have global guests. And what I'm trying to do with this my own show, Rex, is to anticipate your question, which is I want to narrate us through this transition. From all the indicators I now have, we're in the process of a year transition. The election we're watching is stunningly unprecedented. It's because consciousness is changing. People realize they've been had at all levels, not just on space, and they're trying to make a difference. And you're going to see astonishing changes in the real world. You're going to see changes economically. You're going to see dramatic changes militarily. I think we're going to see this transition, and I think it's going to take about a year, and I think this is the year of 2016, which is the year it's all going to take place to prepare it for 2017. Remember I told you 17 is a key number in the Egyptian mythology and in the physics? So if 2017 is when we're supposed to get to where we really know some of this stuff, we got a year to get from where we are now tonight to where we're going to be, and that year I'm trying to narrate on the other side of midnight.
Bring a global awareness. That's wonderful. Thanks for everything, Richard. I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you, Rex. And if you want to do this again, I would say in another 6 months, if not sooner, suddenly things are going to seem so different and so many new revelations will come out. We're going to basically have to do this again.
A very special thank you to our guest tonight. For all of you that had the opportunity to be here with us, if you enjoyed the show, follow us on YouTube, youtube.com/clandestine Time Lord, for the most recent interviews, videos, and podcasts. Or you can check us out on the World Wide Web, www.leakproject.com. Would you like to be a guest on our show? Do you have information that the world needs to see and hear? Send us an email, guestbookings@leakproject.com. Thank you, everybody. This is Rex Bear with Leak Project. Stay safe and be the change you want to see. Good night. report about what happened, and they, a lot of people in the audience thought they were actually going to come out with disclosure, but then they put on that fake alien mask and mocked it, like what you're talking about. So, yeah, they've been doing that for forever. And
Well, do you remember that it was the governor that sponsored that press
yeah,
conference where the fake alien, came out and they took his helmet off and everybody laughed, and it was a systematic government effort started by the governor of Arizona that night to cover up,
well,
to
and didn't he
lie.
even see something? Didn't he actually
Well,
come out before?
that very good, Rex. I was going to get to that. It turns out, decades later, he admitted on a national news show. I forget which. I think it was Larry King. I think Larry King interviewed him. He admitted that that very evening he had seen the same damn thing and had been stunned by it, and then had to come out the next day at a press conference and pretend nothing had happened. What he had seen in the sky, an object, a delta winged craft that, was like half a mile wide or something. I mean,
Right.
astonishing, hovering, floating on anti gravity across the Sun Valley over Phoenix. And the governor of the state simply could not look at a TV camera and say, I saw something amazing. We need to find out what it is. So, is there a cover up? Of course, there's a cover up. Why is there a cover up? I think it goes back to the fundamental religious tenets that we've all been taught in the Western world, that we're it.
Now, the Star Wars movie that came out in '77, it portrays the Death Star, and it looks just like Iapetus. It looks very similar to Mimas and Deimos, and these are these moons that orbit the outer rings of Saturn. And I'm thinking to myself, is it just a coincidence, or was there previous knowledge, and this is like a way to, I don't know, subconsciously bring it out to the masses? What's your take on that?
I think George Lucas is an insider. I think Star Wars is our real history. Let me repeat that. I think Star Wars is our real ancient galactic history, and everything else is fake. Everything else is made up. Everything else is just academia feeding us a line because we cannot, for all kinds of reasons, know the truth. And the reason that I think George Lucas is on the inside is because when you start comparing the data we're putting together on the solar system, the extraordinary high-tech civilization that once was here before us, the major modifications, not just of the surfaces of various planets, but the actual rearranging of planets, redesigning the system, moves, everything the Japanese have told us, everything the Russians have told us, everything the Chinese and the Indians, and am I forgetting anybody who sent spacecraft into space? I don't think so. Every one of these nations is part of a cabal to basically withhold announcing, discussing, presenting, describing, outlining, or explaining the real artificial stuff out there, which is all over, from Mercury, we now know, to Pluto. And instead, they've given us a sterile solar system, sans the works of intelligence, because somehow that subject, who we really are descended from, and what really happened in the past, is all taboo.
Well, and why do you think that is? Why don't they want us to know where we came from?
That's the $64 million question. And again, I can speculate. I can refer to certain comments by officials. I can refer to news reports. How at the end of every news report, regardless of what network, regardless of what station, regardless of what country, if they do UFOs or ETs or any kind of off-world story, it's always called the kicker. It's always at the end of the newscast, and it's always ha 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 ha. Isn't that funny?
Right.
Systematically, we are being programmed and have been programmed for obviously decades, if not centuries, that we're the only thing that is. Now, that, of course, when you ask for the explanations, why? Well, the first explanation probably is religious. In all of our religious traditions, except for the Eastern traditions, Hinduism, etc., basically, human beings, man, as it's called in the Old Testament of the Bible, is all alone. We're it. We're the cat's meow. We're the top of the totem pole. We're the apex of Darwinian evolution. We're whatever supreme position you want to put the human race in, Rex, that's where officials and the mainstream and academia and religious authorities and everybody else has put us. So any evidence against that, basically shattering that paradigm, telling everyone at some point on the planet who reads their religious texts that the most fundamental part of those texts, that we're alone, is wrong, start right there. That, I think, is the fulcrum. That's the reason we have been systematically lied to on this data for decades.
And that definitely makes the most logical sense, in my opinion. I remember several years ago, a long time ago, back in the 90s, when the Phoenix Lights happened, and then there was the official...
What got me into all of this, and why we're having this discussion this evening, is about 30, 40 years ago, I started looking at some images of Mars, and I realized that there was something astonishing that other scientists, other journalists, other investigators had not all put together, and that is that there appears to be a global civilization, an ancient, extraordinarily high-tech civilization that once lived on Mars and is no more. And that collapses probably 20 years into one sentence, because NASA has not been cooperative. They're the ones initially taking all these images, and it's only because of leaks, because of finding other versions of images, of finding people who are willing to talk about what they've seen in the labs, like at JPL or in Houston or other places at NASA, that we've kind of pieced together the idea that NASA for the last 50 years, if not, slightly longer, given that its first spacecraft was launched in January of 1958, it has been engaged in a methodical, systematic cover-up of everything that's real in the solar system made by somebody. They'll tell us the geology, they'll go on about the magnetospheres and the radiation and the particles and the layered sediments and the various atmospheric processes. The thing they cannot go near, the thing that they won't touch, the thing that they haven't told us the truth about from day one, is the fact that we are living, Earth now, 21st century, we are living and orbiting in a previously inhabited solar system whose inhabitants wielded technology that was basically the equivalent of the gods. As my old friend Arthur Clarke would say, any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. This technology, this physics, is basically magic. It seems to contradict what we think we know in terms of EM physics. And it allowed them to remodel and remake and reorder the entire solar system. And then something incredible happened a long time ago, millions of years ago. We really don't have any kind of an exact date yet because we don't have ground truth. And everything went away. And we're what's left. We're the survivors. Are we the survivors of the guys who originally did all this millions or even billions of years ago? Is the human race the logical successor, genetic successor to these beings? I have no idea because, again, we don't have ground truth. But Rex, what I can say to you tonight is that everything that NASA has told us about the solar system, everything that ESA, which is the European Space Agency, has told us, moving planets, I mean, that takes major understanding of gravity and inertia and all that. So torsion field physics, we now know, based on separate experimentation that started in the old Soviet Union back even before the Cold War ended, we now know that such a physics is real, that it exists, that it can create phenomenon, that it can be developed into technology, that you can basically create torsion field technologies to remove gravity and change inertia and move across space and find energy from beyond this dimension, etc. So given that incredible technological foundation, the idea that someone before us long ago rearranged everything that we're looking at becomes a little less, hard to swallow. So when I found during the Cassini mission in 2004 that the Cassini spacecraft had gone by one of these moons of Saturn and had relayed back pictures that showed that this moon, Iapetus, which was the star, by the way, of Arthur C. Clarke's, famous 2001: A Space Odyssey, in the novels, in his novels, it was Saturn and Iapetus where the bizarre Stargate and the keys to a high-tech previous technological presence in the solar system, et cetera, was basically sequestered. So when I'm looking at the actual real images from NASA of Iapetus in the late winter, early spring of 2004, 2005, in those few days around the turn of the year, what I was stunned by was that the images of Iapetus not only looked geometric, but in fact, at some angles, some light, and some images taken, days into the sequence, it actually did look like the Death Star in Star Wars. So, big picture, I think NASA is quietly assembling data to basically document all over the solar system, including its recent visits to asteroids and comets and little tiny objects that we normally wouldn't think of as part of the mainstream decoding of how the solar system came to be. I think that they've been running two parallel missions. One that we get to see the geology, the history, how did the solar system originate and how did it evolve and how did the various environments, develop the way they are now. And the hidden mission, the secret mission, as my friend Keith Laney says, one of my imaging guys, is to document and find a lot of artifacts and try to put together by remote control, by remote sensing, the ancient history of this planet. And
Hey folks, Rex Bear here with Leak Project. We have a fantastic show lined up for you with Richard C. Hoagland. This guy is a pioneer in the disclosure movement, founder and chief investigator of the Enterprise mission, radio host at The Other Side of Midnight, former science advisor to CBS and Walter Cronkite, recipient of the Angstrom Medal, author and whistleblower. Mr. Hoagland's work has been featured in many magazines and news outlets around the world and is a regular guest with Coast to Coast AM. We will be discussing several incredible anomalies discovered via NASA and other satellites sent to Iapetus, Phobos, Mars, Pluto, and our own moon right next door. You can find more about Richard and his work as well as analysis at www.enterprisemission.com. Also, make sure to listen to his radio program, othersideofmidnight.com. Richard, it's great to have you on the show tonight with us here at the Leak Project. How the heck are you?
Hi, Rex. Great being here.
It's fantastic to have you. We talked for a minute before the show. As I said, I've been following your work now for years, and I'm just amazed with these anomalies that you've discovered on different celestial bodies. The first topic I was hoping we could discuss is Iapetus and all the incredible information that you've got compiled on your website that points to it possibly being an artificial moon even. It looks just like the Death Star, in my opinion.
Isn't that amazing?
It is, yeah,
that
absolutely.
Is so eerie. Well, actually, Rex, we should go back to the beginning. I used to be, straight mainstream, as you said, Cronkite's advisor, NASA, etc., museums, mainstream science, hung out with Carl Sagan, Arthur Clarke, one of my best friends, obviously, until he died, and Gene Roddenberry and all that. And anyway, so